Welcome back, everybody, to episode 4 of Module 4. Mannerism is a style in European art that emerged in the later years of the Italian High Renaissance, around 1520, spreading about 1530 and lasting until about the end of the 16th century in Italy. Mannerism may also be known as the Late Renaissance. Mannerism coincided with a period of great upheaval that was caused by the Reformation, the plague, and the devastating sack of Rome. It encompasses a variety of approaches influenced by and reacting to the harmonious ideals associated with such artists as Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Vasari, and early Michelangelo. Where High Renaissance art emphasizes proportion, balance, and ideal beauty, Mannerism exaggerates such qualities, often resulting in compositions that are asymmetrical or unnaturally elegant. Notable for its artificial as opposed to its naturalistic qualities, this artistic style favors compositional tension and instability rather than the balance and clarity of earlier Renaissance painting. Mannerism works appear strange and unsettling, despite having a superficial sense of naturalism. The illogical compression of space, the elongated proportions and exaggerated anatomy of the figures, the convoluted serpentine poses, these things at play in Mannerist painting frequently create a feeling of anxiety in the viewer. And we can see these qualities in the work of one of the most radical Mannerists, Rosso Fiorentino. Fiorentino was born and he trained in Florence. Rosso is the Italian word for red and is a nickname given to the artist due to the color of his hair. From his early Florentine works, he displayed a particularly original style, characterized by strong energy and compositions with a powerful and dynamic charge. We see this in the tangled and chaotic quality of his painting, Moses Defending the Daughters of Jethro. The painting portrays the agitated sequence of different events that make up the biblical episode from which it takes its name. In the foreground, we see Moses depicted like a semi-nude Herculean hero. He's tackling the shepherds who lie on the ground defeated. The victorious hero appears again in the background, running towards Zipporah, his future bride. Rosso Fiorentino interprets the holy episode as a scene of nude figures fighting. Their powerful bodies, strained in an exasperated dynamism, resemble the tangle of soldiers in Michelangelo's cartoon for the Battle of Cassina. The artist drastically compressed the space, as we see in the well at the top against the sky, and also in the daughters' faces in the upper right. Rosso also used foreshortening, or the depiction of an object in space so that it recedes away from the viewer. We see this in the torsos of Moses and in the two fallen shepherds at the lower portion of the canvas. The drama in this work is intense, but it's also somewhat contrived. Notice the compression of space caused by the overlap of two goats next to the central figure of Moses, and the crawling figure of the shepherd cropped closely to the edge of the painting right next to them is very interesting. This arrangement of these figures has nothing to do with believable space, but it adds an air of claustrophobia to the scene, and it's interesting in a strange kind of way. The shepherd on all fours looks back in anguish on the actions of Moses and almost seems on the verge of becoming an animal. Such pictorial strangeness is typical of Central Italian Mannerism. The character of Mannerism continues to be debated by art historians. It's often discussed and judged in relationship to the High Renaissance that preceded it. Some scholars see Mannerism as a reaction to Renaissance classicism, while others regard it as a logical extension of it. Today, Mannerism emerges more clearly as a link between the High Renaissance and the emotionally charged dynamic of the Baroque era that followed it. The Baroque period lasted into the early 18th century. Artists expanded on Renaissance techniques to take art in a more dramatic direction, and many of the characteristics of the Baroque style were fueled in part by religious controversies that arose out of the Protestant Reformation and the Roman Catholic Church's response. In a series of decrees that emanated from the Council of Trent, the Church reaffirmed the mysteries of the sacraments, glorified the saints, and encouraged the arts as aids to prayer. Much Baroque religious art places a new emphasis on a personal and on mystical types of faith. Baroque art turned away from the sometimes exaggerated figuration of Mannerism and toward the classical principles of the Renaissance. It emphasized anatomically correct figuration and a convincing three-dimensional space. During this period, artists used Renaissance techniques to move art more in the direction of drama, emotion, and splendor. Artists generally treated light, space, and action in a more dynamic fashion. The compositions use sharp diagonals and extreme foreshortening, and we can see that this is a new degree of a vivid realism. The visual characteristics of Baroque emphasize the dramatic aspects of scenes with almost theatrical settings and intense individualistic expressions, and serve as a means to appeal directly to the emotions of the viewer. Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio, we'll call him Caravaggio, is a pioneer of the Italian Baroque style that grew out of the ruins of Mannerism. He developed a style of unflinching realism, unprecedented approachability, and a direct appeal to the emotions. The characteristic that Caravaggio is most known for is his intense naturalism, the faithful depiction of the visible world. Rather than any attempt at idealizing the subject of the painting, Caravaggio's paintings often include depictions of dirty feet and sweaty clothes of poor pilgrims, and the deep pathos of the poor and outcast, as he took religious themes and visually brought them down to earth. His down-to-earth realism was thought to be revolutionary for the time. Striking realism, strongly contrasting tones, piercing light, and vast pools of inky shadows guide the attention of the viewer and intensify the subject matter. They also heighten the emotional challenge and the drama of the images. We're looking at two works on screen. In The Calling and Martyrdom of St. Matthew in the Contarelli Chapel in Rome, the diagonal shaft of light makes visually clear a moment when ordinary reality was interrupted by the illumination of the divine. The painting depicts the story from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus saw a man named Matthew at his seat in the custom house and said to him, "Follow me." And Matthew rose and followed him. Caravaggio's Matthew, the tax collector, is sitting at a table in a bar with four men. Jesus and St. Peter have entered the room, and Jesus is pointing at Matthew. A beam of light illuminates the faces of the men at the table who are looking at Christ. The single moment, as depicted by Caravaggio, is a depiction of a moment of spiritual awakening and conversion. This subject was something many Baroque artists were interested in painting, especially Caravaggio. In this work, Caravaggio draws inspiration from his own world, placing the biblical scene in modern reality. This work is evidence of Caravaggio's artistic confidence. He wasn't comfortable with the traditions of contemporary idealization in painting, and so he dressed the subjects in contemporary clothes. The art of the High Renaissance creates a sense of the divine by making the figures ideally beautiful. But Caravaggio's figures are, as he said, earthbound. They look like people he might have seen on the streets of Rome. Additionally, in this work, there is a likeness between the gesture of Jesus as pointing towards Matthew and that of God as he awakens Adam in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, which we saw in an earlier portion of this module. Rather than Leonardo's subtle transitions of color and light, Caravaggio took chiaroscuro further by developing tenebrism. Tenebrism is characterized as an extreme version of chiaroscuro. There is no atmosphere in these shadows. In 1600, Caravaggio received a commission to create two paintings for the funerary chapel of the Pope. In the Conversion of St. Paul, Caravaggio's figure is intensely illuminated as if by a spotlight in an otherwise very dark setting. Before his conversion, Paul had spent much of the first half of his life persecuting the early Christian movement. Caravaggio uses directed lighting and strong contrast to imply a blinding flash, symbolizing the evangelist's sudden and soul-shattering conversion to Christianity. The intended location for this painting, the Santa Maria del Popolo, was one of the principal pilgrimage churches of Rome, and that placed it at the northernmost edge of the city. These paintings were aimed squarely at poor pilgrims, intending to foster in them a sense of identification with the equally impoverished first followers of Christ. Caravaggio seemed a fitting choice for this commission, as he was known for accentuating the poverty and common humanity of Christ and his followers, the apostles, the saints, and the martyrs. The figure of Paul in Roman dress is foreshortened and pushed into the foreground, presenting such a close view that we feel as though we were right there with him. In heightening our experience of the supernatural character of the spiritual events he portrayed, Caravaggio evokes a feeling for the mystical dimension within the ordinary world. This emotional realism was perceived by some as too strong for those accustomed to images representing piety. We see an example of Caravaggio's influence in the work of Artemisia Gentileschi, who turned the style toward a depiction of women as religious heroes. Judith and the maidservant with the head of Holofernes is a scene from the Old Testament story of the heroic Judith, who helped to liberate the Jews from foreign domination by visiting the Assyrian general Holofernes in his tent, getting him drunk, and then cutting off his head. Many authors have interpreted the Gentileschi work as being autobiographical. The artist used many of her own features in Judith's face, and according to one author, this shows that she identified with the heroine. This could be an example of an attempt to interpret the artist's work exclusively based on autobiography. And while biography is one aspect of the context in which any artist's work can be interpreted, let's keep it about this work for now by saying that this inclusion of self-portraiture was common among a wide range of artists at the time, such as Titian, Michelangelo, and even Caravaggio himself. So here we're looking at a comparison with Caravaggio's painting of the same moment within that biblical story. So looking at the Baroque visual language here, we see diagonals, strong diagonals, playing a direct role in the focus of this work and in the drama of the work. Both artists are using foreshortening. Both artists exhibit a brilliant use of light to direct the eye and to heighten the drama. And both artists are working with deep tenebrism, also known as the dark manner, to create a sense of shallow space and also drama. So this is the moment when Holofernes is drunk and asleep and Judith cuts off his head. Here, a study in differences between the two paintings reveals the extreme violence in the Gentileschi painting. Here, Judith grasps the beard and the hair with her left hand as she draws the sword across with her right. We know how painful and debilitating that grasping of the hair, pulling of the skin would be. Very different from the Caravaggio, where Judith looks very dainty almost, and as though she isn't sure of what she's doing, or doesn't even really have the strength to do it. The use of the diagonals in the extended arms of the women can be contrasted with similar diagonals in the dying Holofernes. And in this case, we're looking at Gentileschi's painting again. So the use of diagonals is a little different here than it is in the Caravaggio version. The women's arms seem strong, like they are exerting the fullest force possible right now. And we even see the Holofernes figure himself pushing up at the face of the maid, using apparently all the strength that he has left as well. But take a look at the left arm and the far knee. Both of those limbs appear to be already cut off. All of the angles at use here draw us to the moment. Holofernes' head is close to us, and Judith holds it down, and this makes the head seem already decapitated. The amount of strength that we can see in both the maid and in Judith is incredible. Holofernes is struggling as much as he can. It certainly takes the two of them to hold him down. And Judith has her sleeves rolled up as though she's ready for work. The naturalism in all of these details is so palpable, and that is the heart of Baroque art. So we mentioned a little bit about using biographical information to interpret a work of art. So I want to talk a little bit more about Artemisia Gentileschi. She does have some events in her personal background that may be disturbing to some. So before we get into the details, I just want to let you know ahead of time. In an era where women had few opportunities to pursue artistic training or work as professional artists, Gentileschi was the first woman to become a member of the Accademia di Arte del Disegno in Florence, and she had an international clientele for her paintings. She was producing professional work by the age of 15. Her father, Orazio Gentileschi, was a major follower of the revolutionary Baroque painter Caravaggio. She was an important second-generation proponent of Caravaggio's dramatic realism. She was a pupil of her father, but also of his friend, the landscape painter Augusto Tassi. She painted at first in a style indistinguishable from her father's somewhat lyrical interpretation of Caravaggio's paintings. Her first known work is seen here on the slide to the left, and it is Susanna and the Elders, painted in 1610 when Gentileschi was 17 years old. Gentileschi was known for being able to depict the female figure with great naturalism and for her skill in handling color to express dimension and drama. Her achievements as an artist were long overshadowed by the story of Agostino Tassi raping her when she was a young woman and Gentileschi being tortured to give evidence during his trial. The return of interest in Gentileschi dates from the 1970s, when the feminist art historian Linda Nochlin published an article entitled, "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" That question was dissected and analyzed. The article explores the definition of great artists, quote unquote, and posited that oppressive institutions, not a lack of talent, have prevented women from achieving the same level of recognition that men received in art and other fields. Gentileschi is considered among the most accomplished of 17th century artists and is one of the most progressive and expressive painters of her generation. Gian Lorenzo Bernini was as influential in sculpture as Caravaggio was in painting, and his David is an example of Baroque art's movement away from references to Greek classicism. Rather than capture an introspective moment before the battle, as Michelangelo did, Bernini depicted David in the midst of his backswing as he prepares to fling the stone at Goliath. Between these two artists is the Baroque emphasis on emotion and drama versus the Renaissance expression of mind and balance. Bernini's David is wearing clothing of a shepherd, and this suggests a specific individual, versus the nude ideal and the philosophical ideal of man in the Michelangelo. Bernini's sculpture suggests that taking action in the heat of the moment is the best path to the soul and the feelings, versus the ideal that is monumental and eternal. The clarity of the action of this David is something we can directly relate to, versus a contemplative, perfect ideal that seems frozen in time. Bernini's elaborate orchestrations are the climax of Italian Baroque expression. The emotional intensity of his art is vividly apparent in his major work, The Ecstasy of St. Teresa, which features a life-size marble figure of the saint and depicts one of her visions as she recorded it in her diary. In this vision, she saw an angel who seemed to pierce her heart with the flaming arrow of gold, giving her great pain as well as great pleasure, and leaving her all on fire with the great love of God, as she wrote in her autobiography. Bernini made the visionary experience vivid by portraying the moment of the greatest feeling, revealing spiritual passion through physical expression. A skylight above provides dramatic lighting for the sculpture, and turbulent drapery heightens the emotional impact. Bernini's departure from the balanced classical norm soon influenced sculptors throughout Europe. Drama that Bernini brought to sculpture and architecture extended into all the visual arts of the 17th century. Although Baroque artistic principles were taken across Europe, each country developed them in their own way. The Flemish artist Peter Paul Rubens painted in a particularly exuberant and dynamic Baroque style. Rubens had traveled to Italy and studied the works of the Italian masters. He also visited and worked for several royal courts, including the courts of Paris, where he created a series of 24 monumental paintings of the life of the Queen Mother, Marie de Medici. The purpose of the paintings was to celebrate the French monarchy and to celebrate Marie's right to rule following the death of her husband, Henry IV. Henry receives a portrait of his betrothed, Marie, and it's held by the gods of love and marriage. The goddess Minerva speaks into the king's ear, telling him about Marie's virtues, while the king and queen of the gods, Jupiter and Juno, look down approvingly from above. So everybody approves. Rubens' Baroque style is seen in the grand diagonal composition of these two very different works now on screen. It is perhaps more obvious in the first painting, but it can be seen as the movement that links the king in the bottom right corner with the two gods in the above left corner in the presentation of the portrait. The colors are vivid and saturated, with reds, blues, and golds repeated to unify these images. The play of light and shadows is dramatic, with bright highlights giving way to deeper shadows than the quality of the light might actually produce. Textures and details are finely rendered, from the metal armor to the silk garments of the king and the gods, to the realistic detail in the foliage of the raising of the cross and the dog at the bottom left. These details shows Rubens' Flemish heritage from Jan van Eyck and others. The figures in both works each possess a heroic physique in their garments. Both paintings seem to quiver with potential energy and movement, despite their different themes. In the raising of the cross, the action and the drama in the work seems to burst out of the frame, led by the upward glance of Christ and the base of the cross, which seems to extend downward into our space. This visual dynamism, extending the action of the work toward the viewer, marks both works as Baroque painting. Rembrandt van Rijn was a Dutch Golden Age painter, printmaker, and draftsman. An innovative and prolific master in all three media, he is generally considered one of the greatest visual artists in the history of art. Unlike most Dutch masters of the 17th century, Rembrandt's work depicts a wide range of styles and subject matter, from portraits and self-portraits to landscapes, genre scenes, allegorical and historical scenes, biblical and mythological themes, and animal studies. His contributions to art came in a period of great wealth and cultural and scientific achievement that historians call the Dutch Golden Age, when Dutch art, and especially Dutch painting, was prolific and innovative. Rembrandt's large work, like the Baroque painting Return of the Prodigal Son, is among the Dutch master's finest works. It was likely completed within 2 years of his death. Depicting the moment of the prodigal son's return to his father in the biblical parable, it is a renowned work described by the art historian Kenneth Clark as a picture with which those who have seen the original in St. Petersburg may be forgiven for claiming it as the greatest picture ever painted. In the painting, the son is returned home in a wretched state from his travels, in which he has wasted the inheritance of his father and fallen into poverty and despair. He kneels before the father in repentance, wishing for forgiveness and for the position of a servant within his father's household, having realized that even his father's servants had a better station in life than he. His father receives him with the tenderest of gestures and welcomes him as his own son. His hands seem to suggest mothering and fathering at once, so we can see this in the detail to the right. His hands seem to suggest both mothering and fathering at once. The left hand appears larger and more masculine, and it's set on the son's shoulder, while the right hand is softer and more receptive in gesture. Rembrandt portrays this touching scene with great reserve and economy. We see the prodigal son's ragged clothing and the father's gentle embrace. We also see, standing at the right, hanging back somewhat guardedly, the father's other son, who crosses his hands in judgment. In the parable, he objects to the father's compassion for the sinful son. The Return of the Prodigal Son demonstrates the mastery of the late Rembrandt. His evocation of spirituality and of the parable's message of forgiveness has been considered the height of his art. Johannes Vermeer was a Dutch Baroque painter who specialized in domestic interior scenes of middle-class life. He is considered one of the greatest painters of the Dutch Golden Age, along with Rembrandt. During his lifetime, he was moderately successful as a provincial genre painter. He produced relatively few paintings, primarily earning his living as an art dealer. He wasn't wealthy at his death, and he left his wife in debt. Vermeer worked slowly and with great care, and he frequently used very expensive paints. He is particularly renowned for his masterly treatment and use of light in his work. According to one art historian, all of Vermeer's paintings are apparently set in 2 smallish rooms in his own house in Delft, and they show the same furniture and decorations in various arrangements, and they often portray the same people, mostly women. And there's some truth to this. The kitchen maid here is one example. This is a small painting. It's 18 inches by 16 inches. The artist has concentrated on the way light reveals color, each texture, and each detail. This image has such a clear and luminous vitality. This is a genre painting that raises an experience of daily life to a great solemnity. It's such a small act, but pouring the milk becomes experienced as though it was a solemn ritual. We can feel the quiet of this moment. By depicting the working maid in the act of carefully cooking what is presumed to be bread pudding, the artist presents not just a picture of an everyday scene, but one with an ethical and a social value that would have been understood by the audience of the time. The humble woman is using common ingredients and otherwise useless, stale bread to create a pleasurable product for the household. Her measured demeanor, her modest dress, and her judiciousness in preparing her food conveys one of the strongest virtues, one of the strongest values of the 17th century Netherlands, and that is the value of domestic virtue. Characteristic of Delft artistry and of Vermeer's work, the painting is also strongly balanced in a classical manner. The wall on the left forms the basis with which we move into and across very quickly through the picture. The recession from the left and then the openness to the right, this sort of left corner scheme balance was used by other artists for about 10 years before Vermeer, and he was very quick to pick up the latest thing. So just to be clear, the wall with the window on the left-hand side appears to be moving back into space. And so it's that recession back into space, but then we very quickly our eyes move to the right side, which is more empty in this painting. There's a balance of more versus less, left versus right here in this painting. That's very classical. The painting is strikingly illusionistic, conveying not just details, but a sense of weight in the woman who feels almost like a sculptural figure, and the objects on the table feel like you could pick them up yourself. You can almost taste the thick, creamy milk escaping from the jug. You can feel the cool dampness of the room and the starchy linen of the maid's white cap. The pattern of bright dots on the bread and basket are almost alive with sensation, and it appears to be used to suggest the shimmer of daylight and the textures of the dough at the same time. Half of the woman's face is in shadow. It's impossible to tell whether her downcast eyes and pursed lips expressed willfulness or concentration. There's a bit of a mystery about her for modern audiences. She's going about her daily task. She's faintly smiling, and our reaction to the scene is to wonder what she's thinking. One contemporary critic wrote that in this way, the kitchen maid has a little bit of a Mona Lisa effect in modern viewers' reaction to it. Many artists worked on behalf of the church in the Baroque period, and some worked in service of the nobility. The most innovative of the latter was the Spaniard Diego Velázquez, who spent most of his career in the court of King Philip IV of Spain. Philip was a broad-minded monarch who took delight in his chief painters' sometimes more adventurous works. And we're looking at such a painting here. This is called Las Meninas, which means the Maids of Honor. In this painting, Velázquez plays an elaborate visual game. At first, it's unclear who the subject is because the artist himself stares out from behind a canvas with brush in hand and seems to be a center of focus. The Maids of Honor then surround the king's daughter, who gazes curiously out at us as if expecting something. So is she the center of focus? She seems to be the center of the composition, and she stands in the brightest light. But then another courtier is contrasted and stands out in an illuminated doorway in the background. So it's only as we make our way through the painting, to the door, to the paintings on the wall above the door in the background, that we then see a mirror on that far wall with two faces. These two faces are the royal couple that are reflected in it, and then we realize that this is a court portrait changed into a visual riddle. Velázquez painted a portrait of himself, painting a royal portrait. During the Baroque period, French artists adopted Italian Renaissance ideas, but made them their own. We can glimpse a clear view of a Baroque aristocratic splendor in the architecture of the French royal palace, Versailles. This was built for King Louis XIV. The main palace and its gardens exemplify the French Baroque architecture and landscape design. And in this side, we're looking at an interior of the Hall of Mirrors. And the painting on the right is made by Pierre Patel, Versailles in 1668, just meant to give you an overview of the entire composition of the land and the space and the building. The Hall of Mirrors at the heart of this palace functioned like a stage set for the king's entrances and exits. The hall appears doubled in width by the nearly solid wall of mirrors opposite the glass windows. Such glassworks were very expensive in that era, making the hall a display of opulence unique in Europe. Almost lost in the reflected splendor is the classical detailing in the pilasters and round arches. The ceiling is covered with paintings that depict the recent exploits of Louis XIV. At Versailles, Louis and his successors created a visual spectacle that supported their belief in the monarchy as the ultimate source of all power. Just as the building of Versailles is associated with Louis XIV, the most significant art movement in France in the first half of the 18th century is associated with his son, Louis XV. The term Rococo comes from the French word meaning shell, because the scallop shell motif is common in Rococo interior decoration. Whereas Rococo interior decoration spread to other countries, notably Germany, the painting style called Rococo is predominantly a French phenomenon. By the 1730s in France, the heavy theatrical qualities of the Italian Baroque gradually gave way to the decorative Rococo style, a light, playful version of the Baroque, if you will. The arts moved out of the marble halls of palaces such as Versailles and into fashionable townhouses such as the Hôtel de Soubise. Comparing this interior with that of the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles shows the delicacy and the detail that exemplifies Rococo. Designers copied the curved shapes of shells for elegantly paneled interiors and furniture, and they influenced the billowing shapes later found in paintings. Also, where the Versailles Hall has a steady march of classically inspired round arches, the Rococo room is irregular, with organically shaped panels between the arches for a more fanciful effect. Rococo was perhaps the most rebellious of design styles. Often described as the final expression of the Baroque movement, it was exceptionally ornamental and theatrical, and was a style without rules. Compared to the order, refinement, and seriousness of the classical style, Rococo was seen as superficial, degenerate, and illogical. It first emerged as a style developed by craftspeople and designers rather than architects, which explains why it is found primarily in furniture, silver, and ceramics. Another key feature of the design is its curved asymmetric ornamentation, where its forms often resemble the letters S and C, and where one half of the design does not match the other, and we can see this in the cabinet to the left-hand side of your screen. Rococo art, sometimes called a feminized version of Baroque style, is associated with the aristocracy. Typically, the paintings depict aristocrats or aristocratic leisure time activity, like courtship rituals, picnics in harmonious and natural environments, excursions to romantic places. The paintings feature beautiful aristocrats in gorgeous clothing. The figures are tall and slender, elegant and graceful. Often the paintings depict a peaceful natural setting with feathery trees and sprays of foliage. These are spring and summer settings without a hint of rain or any natural event to disturb the happiness of the actors in the setting. Colors are gentle, they're often pastels. Sometimes pink roses appear in unnatural profusion. These are happy paintings usually, as if the people in them hadn't a care in the world, except perhaps of not having their love requited. 1780s France embraced both Rococo and neoclassical styles as the Enlightenment was upon Europe. French high society was living lavishly in the Palace of Versailles. Fashion was reaching extravagant heights in France, and Marie Antoinette was the face of it. Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun specialized in portraits, painting both her fellow painters and aristocrats, typically flattering the latter in her depictions. She did a number of portraits of Louis XVI's wife, Marie Antoinette, who was, as we know, later executed, as he was, during the French Revolution. One of Lebrun's paintings caused shock and controversy for its depictions of the king's wife in her chemise, which we can equate with a nightgown. The dress worn by Marie Antoinette in this painting was not French court fashion, but it was formal attire, especially opposed to the previous portrait. This painting represented Marie Antoinette in a blue-gray silk robe à la française and rich pearl jewelry, attributes that better attested to her majesty and her Frenchness. We're looking at two paintings that exemplify the spirit and the style of the Rococo era. These are by Fragonard and Boucher. Boucher rose to prominence under the patronage of and the attention of the king's mistress, Madame du Pompadour. In addition to a productive career as a painter, he was also the principal designer for Sèvres porcelain and Beauvais tapestry works, both that were projects dear to Madame de Pompadour's heart. Boucher imparted the intimacy of the boudoir into all of his subjects, whether those were domestic scenes, pastoral idyls, or mythological themes, and the Toilet of Venus is no different. Fragonard began to study painting with Boucher, adopting the latter's subjects, but painting with a freer technique. He won both admiration for his fluid brushwork and criticism for the dashed and unfinished look of his canvases. During his study in Italy, he sketched Renaissance gardens, and these would continue to haunt his expansive outdoor scenes peopled with tiny figures. As with most Rococo paintings, the subject of Fragonard's The Swing is not very complicated. Two lovers have conspired to get an older fellow to push a young lady in the swing while her lover hides in the bushes, and you can see him in the bottom left. Their idea is that as she goes up the swing, he can get a tantalizing view of her skirt. The figures are surrounded by the typical Rococo lush garden. It's overgrown. Often statues are depicted in these natural parks. The statues will sometimes comment on the actions in the paintings. For example, Venus and her son Cupid here may approve of the flirtations that are going on. A sculptured figure to the left puts his fingers to his mouth as though saying, "Hush," while another sculpture in the background shows two Cupid figures cuddled together. Colors are pastel pinks and greens, and although we have a sense of movement and a prominent diagonal line, the painting lacks the seriousness of Baroque painting. If you look closely, you can see the loose brushstrokes in the pink silk dress and the details in her stockings and garter belt as we get the glimpse of her skirt. Baroque drama here gives way to sensual abandon and light as air subject matter, characteristic of the Rococo era. It was precisely this kind of painting that the philosophers of the Enlightenment were soon to condemn. The next generation of French artists and intellectuals would rebel against the social irresponsibility portrayed in this type of art, which they saw as merely fluffy. The Enlightenment was already breaking out across Western Europe, and that its new ideas of social equality and scientific inquiry would soon shake European culture to its core. They demanded a new style of art, one that showed an example of moral behavior and of human beings at their most noble. The end of Module 4, everyone. Above all, the Renaissance revolutionized people's perceptions of the world and their role in it, rekindling a profound interest in the arts, sciences, and humanities. In your own words, define humanism and discuss this movement's impact during the Italian Renaissance. In your discussion, identify and discuss at least two works of art that demonstrate a humanist outlook. In other words, describe the Renaissance artist's interest in representing the humanist qualities of his human subjects. Identify the title, author, and date of the examples that you select. Next, explain the shift from the Renaissance to the Baroque. What cultural events contributed to the art changes during the 16th and 17th centuries? In your discussion, explain Caravaggio's contributions to the Baroque. Discuss at least one of Caravaggio's paintings that demonstrates his contributions. Looking forward to seeing you all again in Module 5.